and the people that were with him trying to overturn the election. And these are the biggest names. These are the people that were helping him lead the effort. Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, Mark Meadows, his chief of staff, John Eastman, who wrote the whole strategy of trying to get Mike Pence to overturn the election, but was also very involved in the effort to get fake electors from the states Trump was contesting. Kenneth Chesebro was the lawyer who came up with that strategy specifically of saying we can go as long as we get our electors voted on in the state house. They did it secretly in the state house in some cases, including in Georgia, but they did this in 7 different states. So this is a broad, sweeping indictment. In some ways, even though it deals with just one state, more sweeping than the election interference case that we saw Jack Smith take on. And one other point about Georgia, David, Trump was really contesting 7 states, if you include New Mexico, that he lost to Joe Biden. But Georgia was the state that was closest of all of them. And it was a state in the deep South. It was the defeat that hurt Trump the most. More than any of these states, it was the state that he was obsessed with getting his defeat overturned.
And again, this is a speaking indictment, if you will. We've talked a lot about this on the air. I know, Pierre, you're ready to jump in. I just want to read for viewers at home what it says on page 14, which is essentially the first key page after the counts are listed in this indictment. It says defendant Donald John Trump lost the United States presidential election held on November 3rd, 2020. One of the states he lost was Georgia. Trump and the other defendants charged in this indictment refused to accept that Trump lost, and they knowingly and willfully joined a conspiracy to unlawfully change the outcome of the election in favor of Trump. That conspiracy contained a common plan and purpose. That's key there. It contained a common plan and purpose shared by these people. That's the allegation here from Fani Willis, to commit 2 or more acts of racketeering activity in Fulton County, Georgia, elsewhere in the state of Georgia, and in other states, Pierre.
David, extraordinary. You have a local prosecutor using racketeering laws, which are typically used to fight against mobsters and drug lords. And she's basically saying that these people engaged in a plan, knowing that they lost, to basically circumvent the will of the people. And there are specific acts that are being laid out in this indictment. Number one, that this call to the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, in which Trump is asking for 11,780 votes, that was an attempt to basically corrupt an official in the state government. Also, the notion that they were using the fake electors was fraud. So she's saying that there were a group of people led by Donald Trump, he's at the center of it, who engaged in a conspiracy, again, to subvert the will of the people. It's just a stunning case here. We've seen this so many different times before, David, but each case, this is a case study of a local prosecutor saying local laws were broken in the commission of this conspiracy.
She's well known in that community, the first woman to hold this role. She essentially beat her boss to become district attorney in Fulton County. She's known one of the cases she took on was against the school system in that area for cheating. And she prosecuted it in some ways that are quite similar to this, alleging a conspiracy. I want to read from page 15 here. This criminal organization constituted an enterprise, a term that is defined, and she talks about the legal statute that defines this. A group of individuals associated. The defendants and other members and associates of the enterprise had connections and relationships with one another and with the enterprise. And goes on to write, the enterprise constituted an ongoing organization whose members and associates functioned as a continuing unit for a common purpose. Let's get right to Aaron Katersky, our senior investigative reporter outside the courthouse. And Aaron, again, the fact that she's using the state statute here, we know there's one at the federal level as well, but she's turned to the state law that they essentially use to prosecute, mob bosses and criminal organizations.
And in the state of Georgia, the racketeering statute is often used to do other things, to bring these kinds of sweeping cases. It gives prosecutors a little more leeway, David, to bring in evidence, not just from Fulton County, but perhaps from elsewhere in the state. And I took note that one of the people charged here, Misty Hamilton, is the former election supervisor in Coffee County, where there was a supposed breach of election machines. That clearly has constituted some of this criminal conspiracy that's being alleged now. But to see right plainly on page 15, as you point out, that former President Trump, Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, Ken Chesebro, and others constituted a criminal organization, the prosecutor said, whose members and associates engaged in various related criminal activities. And she goes on to list them: false statements and writings, impersonating a public officer, forgery, filing false documents, influencing witnesses, computer theft, computer trespass. This does read like a criminal organization doing something perhaps for profit. But here, the prosecutor, Fani Willis, who we're going to hear from shortly, says the motive was to keep Trump in power unlawfully. David, this indictment was handed up some 12 hours after prosecutors began presenting their case to a grand jury. After dark, after hours, the judge kept his courtroom open, told everybody to hang in there because he was doing the same. They moved very fast, calling witnesses today, calling in some who were supposed to testify later in the week so that they could be on notice and ready. They clearly wanted to get this done, David.
Aaron Gutersky just outside the courthouse. Aaron, thank you. I want to bring in our chief legal analyst, Dan Abrams, also reading through this with us. And Dan, the sweeping nature of this indictment, what do you make of it?
So they're talking about 161 acts that were committed as part of this criminal enterprise. And what she does is she takes it through chronologically, starting from actually before the election. In act number 1, she makes a reference to the fact that on October 31st, he's already talking about making a speech declaring victory, even if he doesn't win. And so she's saying, in effect, that's where it starts. It starts even before Election Day. And then she takes it through chronologically. With each act in these 161 acts, not all of them are specifically related to Donald Trump. Each of them relate to, some of them to Donald Trump, some to others, but ending in false statements that were made to the grand jury even in late 2022. So that is the totality of the criminal enterprise that she's talking about here. But that's just the first count of what appears to be 41 counts in this indictment. Again, some relating to Donald Trump, some relating to others. But when I look at this, I think of a couple of things. First of all, the fact that so many lawyers are indicted here. I mean, these are attorneys who are being charged with a crime for their role in this effort. And I think that when you look at what are the most significant parts of the indictment, I think it goes to not things that just people said, not things that just people advocated, but documents, false documents, falsely claiming these electors, saying, we are the duly elected officials, the representatives of the state, when they weren't. And that's why it's so important that they have cooperators here, because if they do have some of those fake electors who are going to say, presumably, what they knew about exactly what the evidence was, what they were thinking as this was happening. And the second one I think that's really important is with regard to tampering with voting machines. I mean, you're talking about after January 6th, allegations that they're going and accessing voting machines without permission. Those are the kinds of allegations that are tougher to defend against than, well, I thought we'd won. Well, I was just trying to advocate for my case, etc.
Dan Abrams watching this along with the rest of us as we await Fani Willis, the DA there in Fulton County, about 12 minutes past 11 o'clock here on the East Coast. She's expected to speak about 8 minutes from now, shed more light on the indictment, the sweeping indictment just handed up by the grand jury in Fulton County, Georgia. A couple of things that stand out right away, one of which was something we believed might be part of this indictment, and in fact it is, John Karl, this alleged intimidation that we've reported on heavily of those 2 election workers in Georgia.
Yes, this was a major part of the drama in Georgia, the pressure that election workers, including Shay Moss and her mother, Ruby Freeman, who were two workers that were involved in the vote counting, and they came under enormous pressure. They were targeted directly by Donald Trump himself. Donald Trump mentioned Ruby Freeman's name more than a dozen times during that infamous call with Brad Raffensperger, but three names that are directly involved with the effort to intimidate and pressure these two include Stephen Cliffgard Lee. He was a pastor who approached Ruby Freeman at her home and basically made what was allegedly threatening messages. You need to come out and admit the election fraud was here. Do it for the safety of your family, essentially, was the message. Also, a fellow by the name of Trevian Cootie, who was somebody who had worked with Kanye West, who also approached them with the same message. You need to come out and to acknowledge that this fraud that didn't exist, had happened. And the person that set that up, also a fellow by the name of Harrison Floyd. But these were three individuals allegedly directly involved with an effort to intimidate these two election workers who would later go on to testify before the January 6th committee.
We wondered what kind of role Mark Meadows would play in any kind of indictment. Again, the former chief of staff to Donald Trump during that key period, the end of Donald Trump's term as president and leading into all these questions, and of course up to the certification. I want to bring in John Santucci because John, our editorial producer who has covered Donald Trump for years, on page 45 of this indictment, it talks about late December. So this is after the election, obviously, about a week or more before the January 6th certification. And it talks about Mark Meadows sending a text message to the office of the Georgia Secretary of State, Chief Investigator Francis Watson, that stated in part, and this quotes the text message from Mark Meadows to the Secretary of State investigator, is there a way to speed up Fulton County signature verification in order to have results before January 6th if the Trump campaign assisted financially? And Fani Willis goes on to write here, this was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. John, what do you make of that?
Yeah, David, I mean, this really speaks volumes because the question had always been, you know, Donald Trump's team was bifurcated, if you will. There was the team led by Rudy Giuliani outside of the White House that we saw making the trips down to Fulton County, Georgia, out to Pennsylvania, out to Nevada. But there was always that question, David, of what was going on in the White House. What was happening among the individuals that were still closest to the president in the final days leading up to January 6th? And right there, to see in that document, David, that Mark Meadows was on the phones, working it, texting people, offering up from his position as chief of staff financial support from the Trump campaign to do something, if you will, about that election results down in Georgia. It's just striking, David, and it goes to show the way that this indictment has been laid out. I mean, we've been saying this term, speaking indictment, over and over again as we've been going through these different cases for the last several months. But just to see the piecemeal is coming together here, the texts, the tweets, everything that this DA has pulled together from their fact-finding mission, if you will, over the last several months is just incredible. And I think, David, you brought this point up in our past coverage. There has been questions around Trump world of, frankly, who still is in Trump world, who is communicating with Donald Trump. David, I can tell you from talking to multiple sources in just the last few days, it is their understanding that Donald Trump and Mark Meadows have not spoken for several months. And to think, David, that relationship, which was so close, those two guys were considered inseparable at some point. The fact that they're not speaking and now they are both in this indictment, David, you do have to wonder where this does go forward.
But, John, you did learn in recent days that Donald Trump, his legal team at Bedminster, did meet with others who they thought might be pulled into this. Very concerned about what might be coming from this Fulton County DA.
Yeah, David, in just the last couple of days, my sources tell me that Donald Trump actually brought his legal team down in Fulton County, Georgia, up to Bedminster, New Jersey. It was in that meeting, David, that the former president asked his legal team, what is this case going to be? What is this going to look like? And I'm told the two attorneys in that meeting, David, Drew Feinling and Jennifer Little, who have actually been, if you will, some of the longest serving attorneys to Donald Trump in relation to all of these 4 investigations, they told the former president they believed other individuals in addition to him would be indicted. And I'm told, David, that as they went through the possibilities of names, one of the names that Donald Trump focused on quite intently was Rudy Giuliani. And it wasn't so much the idea that, Rudy would flip on me or go against me, but there's actually a personal relationship here, David. Donald Trump doesn't have many personal friends. He has looked at the former New York City mayor and his one-time personal attorney as just that, a close friend of well over 3 decades. Concerned about Rudy, David, but also concerned, David, about who these other people could be. And I would just make one other note, David, that, when we talked about the last indictment we went through, the January 6th indictment, we talked a lot about the unindicted co-conspirators in that case. They weren't named. They weren't identified because they were not indicted. We see in this document from DA Fani Willis that there are at least 30 unindicted co-conspirators. And as we learned just a few hours after Team Trump read through the January 6th indictment, you have got to imagine right now, David, they are doing the same thing. They are pouring through this document, trying to figure out who is who, and then, David, looking in the mirror and saying, do we still have a relationship with any of these people? Could we have a problem here?
Well, it's an extraordinary indictment and sweeping in nature. We are, again, waiting for Fani Willis to come before the cameras. You can see the microphone set up there. This is not only a major local story in the state of Georgia there, but across this country, watching what Georgia would do. Obviously, looking at these two sort of parallel timelines, the special counsel at the federal level and then Fani Willis moving full steam ahead in Georgia in much more of a sweeping nature. Asha Rangappa with Yale Law School, former special agent with the FBI, as we await Fani Willis. Something you had said to us before we came on the air tonight, if Fani Willis moved forward using, RICO, basically in the state of Georgia, we know federal level and state level, but if she cited this law, this code in this indictment, she was essentially saying, they weren't stealing cars or whatever else you might want to accuse them of, but that they were allegedly trying to steal the election?
Yes, she's likening Trump to a mob boss or a gang leader. Fani Willis has actually used this statute to prosecute a leader of a gang before. And what she's saying is that this is a person who is directing a pattern of criminal activity. What RICO allows is for prosecutors to get to the person at the top, the person who may not be involved in every single criminal act. And it allows her to link together a number of sub-conspiracies. So the conspiracy to get the Secretary of State to find those votes, the other conspiracy to submit this false slate of electors. What RICO says is that this is all interrelated criminal activity. It's part of a bigger criminal enterprise. She lists 161 criminal racketeering acts in this indictment. Each defendant only has to have participated in 2 of them to be liable for the whole thing, including Donald Trump. And I think here it's sweeping. It allows her to bring in a lot of activity. It is a contrast with Special Counsel Jack Smith, who has opted for a very streamlined indictment, very simple, straightforward counts, and only 1 defendant. So it has its pros and its cons, and we'll see how she fares with it.
Let me ask a follow-up to those pros and cons, because you mentioned Jack Smith sort of streamlining, mentioning co-conspirators, but not by name, indicting Donald Trump only. She has done a much more sweeping indictment here, not only speaking of co-conspirators, but naming them and charging them. Is that a more challenging case to prosecute, Asha?
I think where the challenge could come is in both not just convincing a jury, but also making the case in the court of public opinion, which when you're prosecuting a former president, I think is really important. So in the former prosecutors that I've talked to, both federal and state, there's been some debate on the keep it simple, stupid approach, where you want everyone to understand exactly what you're doing, or whether you do something so complex that people don't fully get exactly what's going on. I do think here, in looking at the acts that she's presented, she can still tell a pretty straightforward, compelling story. I mean, he was trying to find fake votes. They were trying to present a fake slate of electors. They were harassing election officials. But it is very different than just indicting one person for events that we saw unfold on television, which is what Jack Smith is doing. This is a lot of the stuff that was happening behind the scenes. I think it will be very important that these proceedings are televised, because I think that will allow her to make the case to the American public in a way that Jack Smith might not be able to, since his proceedings won't be broadcast.
And Asha, for those of us who aren't lawyers, and that includes me right here, I mean, we're going to see this because there are cameras in court in Georgia. That's going to be a key difference here. But also, do we see them brought in as a group? If she's alleging this conspiracy, she's named all of them and indicted them on many of the same charges. I mean, you look at Donald Trump, counts 1, 5, 9, 11, 13, 15, 17, 19, 27 through 29, 38 through 39, and just beneath him, Rudy Giuliani, counts 1 through 3, 6 through 7, 9, 11, 13, and so on and so on. I mean, will you see these alleged co-conspirators brought into that courtroom during this trial together?
Well, I think one of the things that Jack Smith was considering in his calculations is that the more defendants you have, the more potential for delay, because you may have defendants who have interests that are adverse to each other. You may have people who flip, and you may have other legal issues that come up. So I'm not sure that you'll see all these people in the courtroom together. I think it might actually be some time before they are in a courtroom. And so that's one of the trade-offs that she's made. On the other hand, this does seem to be a good division of labor between the federal and state governments. We tend to think of presidential elections as being a federal interest, but they're administered by the states. The harm when you interfere in an election accretes to the states that are administering them, and that's what Fani Willis is trying to vindicate here. And in some ways, maybe the extra delay and extra complexity is going to be worth it. I'll add here, David, it's important to note that Trump and his co-defendants won't have the option for a pardon here, a federal pardon, even if he becomes president, because it's a state crime. And in Georgia, the pardon power doesn't actually rest with the governor. It rests with the Board of Parole and Pardons, and can only be given after 5 years of a sentence is completed. So that option is not there for the people who might have been banking on it.
Yeah, a lot of people have been asking that question in this country who've been following these cases. And as Asha rightly points out here moments ago, making the point that any sort of pardon or commuting of the sentence in this case would be very different than the Jack Smith case at the federal level. In Georgia, because it's at the state level, President Trump, if he were reelected, could not pardon himself, could not be pardoned by the governor of Georgia. It would be by the parole board, and only after 5 years of serving any potential conviction and sentence that would go along with it. As we await Fani Willis here, the DA, and forgive me if I have to cut you off, Chris, midway, but let's bring in Chris Timmons, former Georgia prosecutor. He's an expert on the RICO Act right there in Georgia, veteran prosecutor in Georgia. You were looking at this, and I know at first glance, even you said this is massive.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really big indictment. There are 161 acts in furtherance of the conspiracy. One of the things that's important is that not all of them are crimes. For example, if you look at Act number 58, it talks about sending an email. There are other Act number 57. It's against David Schaefer, who's a politician here. Reserved room 216 at the Georgia State Capitol of Fulton County government. That's not a crime in and of itself. It's just an act in furtherance of the conspiracy. So anytime someone performs an act in furtherance of a conspiracy, they join the conspiracy. Probably the best example I can give you of that is, let's take an armed robbery, for example. If you've got 4 people involved in the armed robbery, one person goes off to rent a car, that's not a crime. Another person goes off to buy a gun, again, not a crime. But the folks that have purchased the gun and rented the car, if they then move toward an armed robbery, those are all acts in furtherance of the conspiracy. But it's a sweeping indictment.
And that will be the challenge she faces in drawing it all together and trying to make the case that they each played a role in this. John Karl, just from reporting on Donald Trump for many years, you and I have talked about this before, he doesn't use email. He very rarely, texts people, if you will. But in this indictment, and it is sweeping in nature, so we're still reading through it, they draw direct connections to multiple phone calls to people in very high-ranking positions in the state of Georgia.
It goes day by day by day, and I mean just to pick a couple of these. That he's calling the president pro tem of the Georgia Senate. He's calling the governor of Georgia.
This is Donald Trump
Donald
himself.
Trump himself. There's a lot of calls from Giuliani and the others. Trump himself calling the president pro tem of the Senate, calling Brian Kemp, the governor, calling the attorney general, Chris Carr, the Georgia attorney general, Chris Carr, calling the speaker of the House in Georgia. And in Fani Willis's telling here, trying to get them to violate their oaths of office by taking part in this scheme to overturn the election. And keep in mind, all of these calls are happening. The first one that I can see here from the presidents to Brian Kemp on December 5th is after Georgia has gone through not one, not two, but 3 separate counts of the ballots. There was the election day count, there was a machine recount, and then they actually counted all of the millions of votes that were cast in Georgia by hand. It took weeks. And even after all of that, he's beginning this effort to overturn the election.
And of course, the key moment, that phone call with Raffensperger that gets a
Which was
lot of
just
attention.
one of many
all
calls,
these
because we have a tape of it. But you can imagine what was going on all of these other calls, where he's soliciting, allegedly, according to this indictment, soliciting these public officials, high-ranking officials in Georgia, to violate their oath of office and to make false claims about voter fraud
So as we
in
wait
Georgia.
Fani Willis here, John, let's just listen to part of that phone call with the Secretary of State Raffensperger. Again, just one example of all the phone calls that John points out rightly in this indictment that Fani Willis is making the case Donald Trump was involved with himself directly, multiple phone calls, but here's just one of them.
So, look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state.
So that was the alleged pressure campaign behind the scenes. Obviously, we have reported on that piece of audio before. That was an extensive phone call, by the way, that Fani Willis will point to likely often in this case. I want to bring in Steve Osunsami, who is based in Georgia, covers the nation, but of course, the presidential race, 2020 and 2024 now. Steve, hard to believe it's already here. But in addition, in this indictment, Fani Willis is going to aim to try to hold not only Donald Trump, but these alleged co-conspirators, but primarily Donald Trump, responsible for the false statements made after the election.
That's right, David. And I have to tell you, as a longtime resident here and someone who was here on the ground during the election of 2020, during all of that, you know, I get a little PTSD reading this document and hearing that phone call. I want to point you, though, to page 51, where she breaks down all the different lies that he told to Raffensperger and other state officials, lies against the Fulton County workers, lies about dead voters, all these different lies. For the first time, he is really being held accountable here in this document, in these charges, and so are all these other people who were speaking to House committees, who were talking to state lawmakers, who were using the lies to further their effort. And all of that is being detailed here. I will say that for many, many residents here, these allegations that are being underlined in this document are right on time. There is definitely a feeling in Fulton County that she is doing good work, and that this is something that she should be doing, and that they're hoping that she gets the job done. David.
Steve Osunsami, just outside the courthouse, lives in Georgia, has lived this as someone who is part of that community, but also as a reporter who covered the presidential race leading up to 2020 for us extensively as we await Fani Willis, and we think this could come at any time. Our Chief Justice Correspondent, Pierre Thomas, you heard Steve talk about it, trying to hold Donald Trump accountable and this team of alleged co-conspirators for falsehoods meant to not only fool voters in this country, but to put pressure on local and state officials to listen up here. You know, we got to work at trying to overturn this election, allegedly. That's what she's saying in this indictment was what they were trying to do.
David, absolutely. And one of the things that we'll see if Ms. Willis can prove her case in court, that remains to be seen. But there's been an issue of, does this involve free speech? Was this, you know, politics gone wrong? Was it dirty politics? And what she does in the indictment is she goes to great pains to say that lying in and of itself is not the issue, but look at page 16 of the indictment. It says that, quote, the enterprise made false statements concerning fraud in the November 3rd, 2020 presidential election. The President of the United States Senate, the documents regarding fake electors were given to, the Archivist of the United States of America, the Georgia Secretary of State, and the Chief Judge of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. So in other words, it wasn't just that they were talking about the fake electors being involved in the electoral process. They actually submitted paperwork to officials who were considering the election. Those are overt acts, she said, that go beyond free speech, that go beyond just lying, that go beyond politics. They go to, again, trying to influence the people who were making the decision about the election. That's the things that she's taking great pains to do in this indictment.
Making the case that this was a plan, and the team was in on the plan.
You know, one important point of that is who was he trying to pressure? Who were they trying to pressure? It was all Republicans. The people I listed of those phone calls, Brian Kemp, who he wanted to hold a special session of the legislature to overturn the certified election results. Republican governor, Raffensperger, Republican Secretary of State, Chris Carr, Republican Attorney General. The Republican Speaker of the House, the Republican pro tem of the Senate. These were Republican officials, and it should be said, it's important, they're not indicted here, because almost to a person, they refused to go along with it.
And in fact, if you listen to more than just that moment in the phone call, there are many times when Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State, says, you know, that is not true, Mr. President. And he would try to make his case as to why they believed in Georgia that our final tally is accurate. And it's part of the phone call that doesn't get a lot of attention, but will now that this case plays out. As we wait, Fani Willis, Rachel Scott, you're just back into the studio here with us from the campaign trail. You were in Iowa just this weekend. You worked your hardest to get some questions into Donald Trump, and he took them. And one of them gets right to the point of what he's saying publicly on the campaign trail versus his real concern privately. John Santucci talked moments ago about how he brought his lawyers up from Georgia. They met at Bedminster with other members of the team who were helping some of the other people who have been indicted here. Donald Trump very concerned about himself, his future here, and many of these alleged co-conspirators. But the message on the trail, obviously, and his answer to you was very different.
Exactly, David. And the core of this indictment here, these false claims about the 2020 election, are still ongoing. This is the centerpiece of the former president's message now as he continues his third bid for the White House. I asked the former president if he's concerned about spending more time in a courtroom than out on the campaign trail, because as we see it right now, his legal calendar brushing up right against the political calendar, David.
So Fani Willis, the DA there in Fulton County, Georgia, a sweeping indictment, taking her position there now on the national stage in the middle of a presidential election with this indictment. Now, 36 minutes after 11 o'clock in the East, a long day there in Fulton County. Let's listen.
Thank you for joining us. I'm here with the prosecutors and investigators who have worked diligently on the investigation of criminal attempts to interfere in the administration of Georgia's 2020 presidential election. Today, based on information developed by that investigation, a Fulton County grand jury returned a true bill of indictment, charging 19 individuals with violations of Georgia law arising from a criminal conspiracy to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election in this state. The indictment includes 41 felony counts and is 97 pages long. Please remember that everyone charged in this bill of indictment is presumed innocent. Specifically, the indictment brings felony charges against Donald John Trump, Rudolph William Louis Giuliani, John Charles Eastman, Mark Randall Meadows, John Cheeseborough, Jeffrey Clark, Jenna Lynn Ellis, Ray Stallings Smith III, Robert David Cheeley, Michael A. Roman, David James Schaefer, Sean Micah Tresher Steele, Stephen Cliffgard Lee, Harrison William Prescott Floyd, Travion C. Cootie, Sydney Catherine Powell, Kathleen Austin Latham, Scott Graham Hall, and Misty Hampton, also known as Emily Misty Hayes. Every individual charged in the indictment is charged with one count of violating Georgia's Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act through participation in a criminal enterprise in Fulton County, Georgia, and elsewhere to accomplish the illegal goal of allowing Donald J. Trump to seize the presidential term of office beginning on January 20th, 21. Specifically, the participants in association took various actions in Georgia and elsewhere to block the counting of the votes of the presidential electors who were certified as the winners of Georgia's 2020 general election. As you examine the indictment, you will see acts that are identified as overt acts and those that are identified as predicate acts, sometimes called acts of racketeering activity. Overt acts are not necessarily crimes under Georgia law in isolation, but are alleged to be acts taken in furtherance of the conspiracy. Many occurred in Georgia, and some occurred in other jurisdictions and are included because the grand jury believes they were part of the illegal effort to overturn the results of Georgia's 2020 presidential election. The acts identified as predicate acts or acts of racketeering activity are crimes that are alleged to have been committed in furtherance of the criminal enterprise. Acts of racketeering activity are also charged as separate counts in the indictment against those who are alleged to have committed them. All elections in our nation are administered by these states, which are given the responsibility of ensuring a fair process and an accurate counting of the votes. That includes elections for presidential electors, Congress, state officials, and local offices. The state's role in this process is essential to the functioning of our democracy. Georgia, like every state, has laws that allow those who believe that results of an election are wrong, whether because of intentional wrongdoing or unintentional error, to challenge those results in our state courts. The indictment alleges that rather than abide by Georgia's legal process for election challenges, the defendants engaged in a criminal racketeering enterprise to overturn Georgia's presidential election result. Subsequent to the indictment, as is the normal process in Georgia law, the grand jury issued arrest warrants for those who are charged. I am giving the defendants the opportunity to voluntarily surrender no later than noon on Friday, the 25th day of August, 2023. I remind everyone here that an indictment is only a series of allegations based on a grand jury's determination of probable cause to support the charges. It is now the duty of my office to prove these charges in the indictment beyond a reasonable doubt at trial. I would like to take a moment to thank the Superior Court Clerk, Shay Alexander, and her staff for staying late and making sure that this indictment was processed. I would also like to thank the men and women of Sheriff Labatt's office for keeping the courthouse open, but most importantly, for keeping us safe over the weeks and months that have led up to this indictment, and for what I know they will continue to do to keep us safe. We also want to thank the Atlanta Police Department and other law enforcement partners who have worked with the sheriff to keep us safe. I will now take a very limited number of questions prior to going to sleep.
I'll go first. If you don't mind, Surveil Evans with Level One. Quick question: can you clarify in Georgia the mandatory minimum when it comes to RICO charges, whether it's servable by probation or how that might play out?
The RICO charges has time that you have to serve, so it is not a probated sentence.
Madam District Attorney, what's the timetable for the trial?
What is the timetable for the trial? As you know, in this jurisdiction, trials are set by the judges. And so it will be the judge that sets the date of the trial. This office will be submitting a proposed scheduling order within this week. However, that will totally be at the discretion of the judge.
And you're the fourth person, fourth jurisdiction now to indict Donald Trump. Do you want to try him or continue it up? Do you want to be the first to try him?
I don't have any desire to be first or last. I want to try him and be respectful for our sovereign states. We do want to move this case along, and so we will be asking for a proposed order that occurs a trial date within the next 6 months.
Madam District Attorney, there was earlier today there was a fictitious document according to the Fulton County Clerk's Office that was circulated online with charges against former President Donald Trump. That fictitious document matched exactly the charges that we now see in this indictment. Can you tell us more about that document leak? Because now you have the former president's lawyers who are saying this is emblematic of a serious problem with your office.
No, I can't tell you anything about what you refer to. What I can tell you is that we had a grand jury here in Fulton County. They deliberated till almost 8 o'clock, if not right after 8 o'clock. An indictment was returned. It was true billed, and you now have an indictment. I am not an expert on clerks' duties or even administrative duties. I wouldn't know how to work that system, and so I'm not going to speculate. Next question.
Have you had any contact with the special counsel about overlap between these cases, and do you intend to try all of these defendants together?
Do I intend to try the 19 defendants in this indictment together? Yes.
And have you had any contact with the special counsel about the overlap between this indictment and the federal indictment?
I'm not going to discuss our investigation at this time. I'm going to take.
How do you make of the arguments made by former President Trump that this is a politically motivated vote?
I make decisions in this office based on the facts and the law. The law is completely nonpartisan. That's how decisions are made in every case. To date, this office has indicted, since I've been sitting as a district attorney, over 12,000 cases. This is the 11th RICO indictment. We followed the same process. We look at the facts, we look at the law, and we bring charges.
Bonnie Willis, the district attorney there in Fulton County, Georgia, saying she would take a few questions before going to sleep. A nod to this more than 2-year investigation and this very long day working to present her case before this grand jury. Of course, there was the special grand jury during the investigative phase of the case. This was a second grand jury that looked at the evidence, listened to the evidence, and then handed up that indictment late today, now shortly before midnight on a Monday evening here. And she was very clear here. She said she wanted to see the defendant answer to these charges in court. The defendants, because there are 19 named in this indictment, including Donald Trump, by a week from Friday. So she gave August 25th as the date That is 1 week from Friday, somewhere in that window that she said they should be in court to answer these charges. She said that she has no desire to be first or last when it comes to the number of cases that we are now witnessing as a country, the number of criminal indictments against a former president, obviously historic in nature. We say it every time we come on the air. She said, I don't need to be first or last, but I do want a trial date within the next 6 months, which obviously puts this before the presidential election. She said that is up to the judge, though, entirely, though she'll make her own case. And she was asked a key question that we had talked about earlier here on the desk. When you look at this sweeping indictment, the number of people, 19 individuals, including the former president, my question earlier was, will we see them in court together? Will they be tried together as co-conspirators in this case? Her answer was very simple there. She said, yes, I plan to try them all together. All at once. I want to bring in Chris Timmons again, former prosecutor in Georgia. Chris Timmons has watched Fani Willis, her work as a DA. She has used this RICO statute before. Has she been successful with it? What do you make of the case that she presented here tonight? I know it's still early. We're still all reading this indictment, but the fact that she laid it right out there moments ago, I want to try them all at once.
That's not surprising. That's pretty common in a RICO case. I don't expect all 19 to end up going to trial. I think some of the individuals will plead guilty before we get there, probably in exchange for cooperation. But she's done that in the past. The Atlanta Public Schools case, the APS case that we've talked about, was a huge case, involved multiple defendants, multiple attorneys. So it's not unprecedented for her to do something like that, and that's expected. As far as her case, it's pretty straightforward. She's got an indictment that lays it all out, so she didn't need to say a whole lot more about it. She pointed out again that everybody is innocent until proven guilty, but they've got a big indictment. The fact that she suggested 6 months is very ambitious to try a case like this. That suggests that probably by the time that they got through the special purpose grand jury and by the time that they presented the grand jury today, they're ready to go.
She also made it very clear, Chris, that presidential elections are decided at the state level, and we have our own rights and duties, and we're not to be influenced by a president who wants to hold on to the White House.
And that's absolutely correct. And that's an accurate statement of constitutional law. We're all 50 separate countries almost when you think about it under federal law. And we each have our own role to play when we elect a president of the United States. And so to interfere with that role is concerning.
Let's bring in Terry Moran, watching this every step of the way as well. Chris Timmons, we're grateful to have you, former prosecutor there in Georgia. Terry, sweeping nature of this case, very different from what Jack Smith laid out before the American people, particularly in the last couple of weeks with the January 6th related case, the effort to overturn the election. His allegations, names co-conspirators in the indictment, not by name, but in role only, charging only Donald Trump. Here we have a state prosecutor, Fulton County prosecutor, who is now not only named Donald Trump, but 18 others as co-conspirators. She said she'll try them all at once. What kind of challenge are we looking at here?
It's breathtaking, David. Really, this is just, as we go through it line by line and paragraph by paragraph, we see how we are in profoundly uncharted territory, legally and politically. This is a Fulton County prosecutor bringing this RICO indictment, this racketeering indictment, against the former president of the United States, not just for what he did in Georgia, but these acts extend across the nation. And they are not the typical racketeering acts. They aren't, as our guest was just saying earlier, buying a gun or meeting somebody in a parking garage or down on the docks at night. These are press conferences are part of the acts. Tweets are part of the acts. Public political acts. There's a concern among many in this country about the weaponization of law to go after politics. Donald Trump has tested those lines all through his career, and now he faces this amazingly sweeping indictment, and he will have defenses. He will have defenses not just against the notion that this law fits what he did, but he'll say, can you prove that I intended to break the law? I was getting advice of counsel. That's a substantive defense. That I could try to ask Mike Pence to not accept the electoral votes. I could go to the individual states and ask for a different slate of electors, as has happened before in American history. He may be able to make a defense against this sweeping indictment. And with whatever happens in court, it's going to take a long time, and it's just going to really rile up the country politically, because this indictment essentially alleges that from the moment the voting stopped, Donald Trump, since even before, Donald Trump was running a criminal enterprise to try to stay in office. Everything he said publicly, every speech he made, every tweet he posted, everything he did was in furtherance of a criminal conspiracy. That's how ambitious this indictment is. And I don't think it's going to be easy to prove, especially if there are 19 other defendants in the courtroom. Could turn into the Republican version of the Chicago 7 trial back in the 1960s, which became such a madhouse in that courtroom.
Yeah, uncharted territory indeed. And Terry, as you point out, his defense in many of these allegations will be freedom of speech. I have every right to lean on counsel, whether you think that they're the appropriate counsel or not. I can listen to my lawyers who say I can ask Mike Pence, to question this right there along with me. What they will do, though, I'm sure Fani Willis and her team, was that they'll go back to each and every one of these documented phone calls that they have with Donald Trump involved in the call himself. And it's so interesting, Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State, that's the call that most Americans know now. We've reported it inside and out, that particular call where he said, look, all I need are the 11,780 votes. But there's so much more to that call where, throughout the call, you have Brad Raffensperger saying, we don't agree with you that you have won. We believe that, Joe Biden won the state of Georgia. We don't believe that this wasn't an accurate election. They have that side of the conversation, which is something slightly different. Perhaps Jack Smith has, other sides of the conversation too. But this case in particular lays out just the sheer number of conversations that Donald Trump had directly with people in positions of significant power to affect or hold sway over an election.
And that's enormously powerful evidence for the jurors to hear Donald Trump himself say, almost with a sneer in his voice, it's saying, fellas, I just need 11,000 votes. Just find me the votes. That said, if you listen to that conversation or go back and look at the transcript, one of the things Trump is making is arguments as to why he says he believes that the voting machines were tampered with, or that they weren't because that's what he's been told he will say, proving a criminal intent, even in such a damning conversation. Clearly, what Trump did was an attack on the democratic process. Whether or not you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it meets the standard for a racketeering conviction, that'll be before the jury.
A very challenging case indeed, really, for both sides. You lay out the defense quite well there, Terry Moran, and the significant challenge that Fani Willis has ahead of her in prosecuting this case. One thing that struck me, and I know everybody at this desk, including Rachel Scott, who is going to be out right back on the campaign trail probably tomorrow if I know your normal drill. You were the one who pressed Donald Trump in recent days about spending more time perhaps in the courtroom than on the campaign trail, and you weren't being flipped. You're just looking at the timeline here, and now we have another prosecutor who said, I want to see a trial date within 6 months. Yep. Correct me if I'm wrong, which now puts us with Jack Smith requesting the Mar-a-Lago case happen in short order. And then it's requested of Judge Chutkan that the second case, the alleged effort to overturn the election at the federal level, also be tried soon, that the nation has a right to a fair and speedy trial, not only the defendant, but the nation as voters. And now we heard it from her too as well. I'd like it within 6 months. Doesn't matter if I'm first or last, she said, but soon.
Donald Trump's legal calendar is now not just brushing up against the political calendar, it is just downright colliding with it. He has to surrender no later than 8:25. That's 2 days after the first Republican debate. It's unclear if the former president is going to take the stage. January 2nd is when you have a judge in a separate case pushing to start, the special counsel is pushing to start that trial in Washington, D.C. That's 2 weeks before the Iowa caucuses are set to begin. You mentioned the two other cases. We're looking at March, right as the Republican primary starts to heat up. The former president is more likely to be spending more time in a courtroom than he is out campaigning. And so in the short term, what we are seeing is that these indictments are having little to no effect on Donald Trump's campaign. We have seen that his support has grown, in fact, according to polling. But the long term, this is going to become an immense challenge for the former president. There's just no way around it, David.
Really appreciate it, Rachel. Our chief White House correspondent, Mary Bruce. Mary, shortly before midnight here on a Monday, I gather that it'll be the same answer I get from you all the time when I ask you any word from the White House on this latest criminal indictment.
No, David, we know the playbook by now. The White House is not going to comment. The president's not going to comment, nor will his campaign or the Democratic Party. They are trying to stay above the fray on all of this. But while the president hasn't commented and won't on this latest indictment, he has been very clear about his views on President Trump's efforts to overturn the election that Biden won. He has been very clear about the threat that he feels that the former president poses to our democracy. And he has been very blunt about the fact that there's a very real risk that this could happen again. We have heard Joe Biden say in the past, warning that those who tried to stop the transfer of power before will do it again in 2024. We know that former President Trump continues to argue without any evidence that the last election was somehow stolen from him, and polling reflects this. Nearly 70% of Republicans in recent polling say they believe the last election was fraudulent. And this is going to be really at the center of Joe Biden's reelection campaign, arguing, as he did before in the last election, but he's going to do it again in claiming that our democracy is what is on the line in this election, David.
Mary Bruce, our chief White House correspondent. Mary, thank you. I want to get to one other of our reporters, member of our investigative team, Olivia Rubin, who was inside the courtroom, the 8th floor there in Fulton County, who witnessed it all today. And even though this indictment is sweeping 97 pages long, Olivia, there are already strong hints from this DA, from the prosecutor's office, about the sheer amount of evidence that is still to come here.
Well, as we look at sort of where the DA has brought this investigation over the past 2 years, David, and talking to those who have been sort of going in and presenting evidence, we know that there are multiple pieces that she lays out in this indictment in these 96 pages that really we have yet to see. So you sort of play that Raffensperger call, and we can hear ourselves the former president pressuring him, saying, come on, fella, give me a break. But what we know is that there were multiple other calls. There were recordings of those calls, David, which jurors have heard as they're looking over this evidence, but the public has not heard yet. So as we go forward, it is likely that what we are going to see is just more and more and more evidence come out, text messages, emails, recordings of phone calls that will come out in a state that is very committed to the public access to courts, which is why, as I was in there, there was a feed as well, David, that everyone could see what was going on in there today.
Olivia Rubin with us, who was in the courtroom. She's been there every step of the way on most of these cases, witnessing it firsthand. Olivia, thank you. Asha Rangappa was with us earlier, and I want to take something she said to John Santucci, who has covered Donald Trump for years for us, and you heard our legal analyst, Asha, talk about this, John.